the beginning of the biblical story, the world was not a place of suffering, struggle, or death. According to the book of Genesis, humanity began in a place unlike anything that exists today, a perfect garden prepared by God Himself. This place was called the Garden of Eden. It was here that the first humans, Adam and Eve, lived in peace. The garden was filled with beauty and abundance. Trees bore fruit freely, rivers flowed through fertile land, and everything humanity needed for life was already provided. There was no fear, no hunger, no sickness, and no conflict. According to the biblical narrative, Adam and Eve lived in direct relationship with God, walking in the garden and experiencing a world untouched by corruption. But the story that begins in paradise would not remain that way. At the center of the garden stood two mysterious trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God gave Adam one clear command: he was free to eat from any tree in the garden except the tree of knowledge. The warning was simple but serious. If he ate from that tree, the consequences would change everything. For a time, the command was respected. The first humans lived in harmony with the world around them. Yet the biblical narrative introduces another figure who would alter the course of human history. A serpent appeared in the garden. In the story, the serpent was described as more cunning than any other creature. It approached Eve and began a conversation that would eventually lead to one of the most significant moments in the entire biblical narrative. The serpent questioned the command God had given and suggested that eating the forbidden fruit would not bring death, but knowledge. It promised that if Eve ate from the tree, her eyes would be opened and she would become like God, knowing good and evil. Standing before the forbidden tree, Eve faced a moment of choice. The fruit looked beautiful, it seemed desirable, and the promise of knowledge was tempting. In that moment, the harmony of the garden began to shift. According to the account in book of Genesis, Eve took the fruit and ate it. Then she gave it to Adam, who was with her, and he ate as well. What happened next changed the human story forever. Immediately, their eyes were opened. But instead of becoming divine as the serpent suggested, they experienced something entirely new: shame. For the first time, Adam and Eve became aware of their own vulnerability. They realized they were naked, and they attempted to cover themselves with leaves from the trees around them. The innocence of the garden was gone. Later that day, the sound of God moving through the garden echoed among the trees. In earlier moments of their lives, Adam and Eve had walked freely in His presence. But now something had changed. Instead of stepping forward, they hid among the trees, afraid to be seen. When God called out to Adam, the tension of the moment revealed the new reality that had entered the world. Fear, blame, and separation had replaced the harmony that once existed. Adam blamed Eve. Eve blamed the serpent. The unity that once defined their relationship had already begun to fracture. After hearing what had happened, God declared that the consequences of their choice would reach far beyond that single moment. The ground itself would become difficult to cultivate. Human life would now involve hardship, labor, and pain. Relationships would become complicated, and the perfect balance of the garden would be broken. But the most dramatic consequence was still to come. God declared that Adam and Eve could no longer remain in the Garden of Eden. If they continued living in the garden and ate from the tree of life, they would live forever in a fallen state. To prevent this, they would have to leave the paradise that had once been their home. The moment of exile arrived. The gates of Eden, which had once stood open, would soon close behind them forever. According to the account in the book of Genesis, God placed powerful guardians at the entrance to the garden, cherubim and a flaming sword that turned in every direction, preventing anyone from returning to the tree of life. For the first time in human history, Adam and Eve stepped beyond the boundaries of Eden. Behind them lay the world they had always known, a place of abundance, beauty, and divine presence. Ahead of them stretched an unfamiliar land. The Bible gives only a brief description of what came next, but the implications of that moment are profound. They were now alone in a world that had never known human life before. There were no cities, no villages, and no established paths. The fields beyond the garden had not yet been cultivated by human hands. The rivers still flowed. The forests still grew. But the safety of paradise was gone. Adam and Eve had to begin again. The first night outside Eden must have been unlike anything they had ever experienced. Without the protection of the garden, the world suddenly felt larger and more uncertain. The wind moved across the land. The darkness of night settled over the hills and valleys. For the first time, humanity faced a future shaped by survival, learning, and discovery. Yet this moment was not only the beginning of hardship, it was also the beginning of the human story. Everything that would eventually define civilization, family, culture, language, agriculture, cities, and nations would grow from this moment when the first humans stepped beyond the gates of paradise. But the road ahead would not be peaceful, because the first family would soon face a tragedy that would echo through the generations of humanity. When Adam and Eve stepped beyond the gates of the Garden of Eden, the world they entered was completely unfamiliar. Inside the garden, everything had been provided. Food grew easily, the land required no struggle, and the presence of God had been close and constant. But outside Eden, life would no longer be effortless. For the first time, humanity faced a world that required labor, adaptation, and survival. The biblical narrative in the book of Genesis gives only a few brief lines about this period. But those lines carry enormous implications. God had already told Adam that the ground itself would now resist him. The soil would no longer produce food effortlessly. Instead, it would yield crops only through sweat, effort, and patience. Thorns and thistles would grow among the fields, forcing humanity to work the land carefully in order to survive. This marked the beginning of agriculture and human labor. Imagine the first days outside Eden. Adam and Eve had never needed to build shelter before. In the garden, the environment had been safe and harmonious. Now they faced weather, cold nights, and the uncertainty of the open wilderness. They would have needed to find a place to live, gather materials, and create the first simple shelter with their own hands. Every skill humanity now takes for granted had to begin somewhere. They had to learn how to grow food from the soil. They had to discover which plants were safe to eat and which were dangerous. They had to find water sources, explore the surrounding land, and gradually learn how to survive in a world that was no longer perfectly balanced for them. Yet despite the hardships, life continued. The biblical story tells us that Adam and Eve began building a family. In fact, the next major event recorded in the book of Genesis is the birth of their first child. Eve gave birth to a son and named him Cain, according to the scripture. She declared with joy that she had brought forth a man with the help of the Lord. Later, she gave birth to another son, Abel. With these two births, the first human family had begun. For Adam and Eve, raising children in this new world must have been both hopeful and challenging. They had once known a life without suffering, but now they were responsible for guiding their children through a world filled with uncertainty. They had to teach them how to survive, how to work the land, and how to live with the consequences of the choices that had changed their lives forever. As the boys grew older, the Bible describes how they began to develop different roles. Cain became a farmer, working the soil just as his father had been instructed to do. Day after day, he cultivated the ground, planting seeds and waiting patiently for the earth to produce crops. Abel, on the other hand, became a shepherd. He cared for flocks of animals, guiding them through the fields and protecting them from danger. These two occupations, farming and shepherding, would later become central parts of ancient human civilization. In many ways, the lives of Cain and Abel reflect the earliest forms of human society. As it began to take shape outside the boundaries of Eden, for a time, life seemed to move forward normally. The family worked, grew, and continued building their lives in the world beyond the garden. Yet beneath the surface, tensions were quietly forming, tensions that would eventually lead to the first great tragedy in human history. The turning point came during a moment of worship. At some point in their lives, both brothers chose to bring offerings to God. Cain presented the fruits of the ground that he had worked so hard to cultivate. Abel brought the best portions from the firstborn of his flock. According to the biblical account, God looked with favor upon Abel's offering, but not upon Cain's. The reason for this difference has been debated for centuries. Some scholars believe Abel offered the best of what he had, while Cain may have offered something less carefully chosen. Others suggest the issue was not the offering itself, but the attitude of the one presenting it. Whatever the reason, the result was clear. Cain felt rejected. The disappointment quickly turned into anger. The book of Genesis describes Cain's face falling as frustration and jealousy grew within him. Seeing his anger, God spoke to him with a warning. He told Cain that sin was crouching at the door like a predator waiting to strike. Cain still had the choice to master it, to control the rising darkness within him. But the warning was not enough. The tension between the brothers continued to grow until one day Cain invited Abel to go out into the field with him. Away from their family and the safety of home, something terrible happened. Cain attacked his brother. In that lonely field, far from the paradise their parents once knew, the first act of human violence took place. Abel was killed by his own brother. This moment marked a new and tragic chapter in the human story. Not only had humanity lost Eden, but now the first family had been shattered by jealousy, anger, and violence. The world outside the garden had revealed another painful reality. The brokenness introduced by that first act of disobedience could spread from generation to generation. When God later confronted Cain about what had happened, he asked a question that would echo throughout history. "Where is your brother Abel?" Cain responded with words that have become some of the most haunting in all of Scripture. "Am I my brother's keeper?" But the truth could not be hidden. The blood of Abel cried out from the ground, and the consequences of Cain's actions would follow him for the rest of his life. The earth he had once farmed would no longer yield its strength to him, and he would become a wanderer across the land. For Adam and Eve, The loss must have been devastating. They had once lived in perfect harmony within the Garden of Eden. Now they had experienced exile, hardship, and the unimaginable pain of losing one son to death and another to exile. Yet even after this tragedy, the human story would continue to unfold. Because the Bible tells us that Adam and Eve would have another son, one whose life would begin to shape the future of humanity in ways they could not yet imagine. After the tragedy between Cain and Abel, the world outside the Garden of Eden entered a new and uncertain chapter. The first human family had already experienced loss, exile, and the painful consequences of jealousy and violence. Yet even in the shadow of that tragedy, the story of humanity continued to unfold. According to the narrative in the book of Genesis, Cain was forced to leave the place where his family had settled. God declared that the ground would no longer yield its strength to him, and that he would become a wanderer across the earth. For someone whose life had been centered on farming the land, this punishment carried deep meaning. Cain feared something else as well. He believed that anyone who encountered him might try to take revenge for the death of Abel. But the biblical account describes God placing a mysterious mark upon Cain, often referred to as the mark of Cain, as a sign that no one should harm him. This strange and often misunderstood detail has fascinated readers for centuries. The Bible never clearly explains what the mark looked like, only that it served as a protection. With that mark upon him, Cain left his family and traveled east of Eden to a region called Land of Nod. The name of this place carries a symbolic meaning as well. The word Nod is often connected to wandering or exile. In other words, Cain's new home reflected the life he was now destined to live, a life marked by distance, movement, and separation from what he had once known. Yet something unexpected happened during this time. Instead of remaining a solitary wanderer forever, Cain eventually settled and began building a new life. The book of Genesis tells us that Cain had a son, whom he named Enoch. In honor of his son, Cain built a city and named it after him. This detail is remarkable. The very first city mentioned in the Bible was built by the man who had committed the first murder. In a sense, civilization itself began to grow from a world already marked by human imperfection. The descendants of Cain gradually began to develop the foundations of early human culture. The Bible provides a brief but fascinating glimpse into this process. Several generations after Cain, his descendants began shaping different aspects of society that would influence humanity for centuries to come. One of his descendants, Jabal, became known as the father of those who lived in tents and raised livestock. This suggests the rise of nomadic pastoral communities, groups of people who moved with their animals across open lands in search of food and water. Another descendant, Jubal, was described as the father of those who played the harp and flute. In other words, the earliest traditions of music and artistic expression appear within this same family line. A third figure, Tubal-Cain, became known as a skilled craftsman who worked with bronze and iron. This marks one of the earliest references in the Bible to metalworking and technological development. These brief descriptions suggest something fascinating about the early chapters of human history. Even after tragedy and exile, humanity continued to create, invent, and build. The first elements of culture, music, craftsmanship, and organized communities began to emerge. But the story of Cain's family also reveals another troubling pattern. Several generations after Cain, a man named Lamech appears in the narrative. Lamech openly boasted about acts of violence, declaring that if Cain had been avenged 7 times, he himself would be avenged 77 times. His words suggest a world where aggression and pride had begun to grow stronger over time. The seeds of violence planted in the field where Abel died were beginning to spread. Meanwhile, far from the settlements of Cain's descendants, the lives of Adam and Eve continued. They had experienced the loss of Abel and the exile of Cain, but their story was not yet finished. The Bible tells us that Eve later gave birth to another son. She named him Seth. According to Eve, Seth had been given to replace Abel, whose life had been taken too soon. But the birth of Seth carried meaning far beyond the restoration of one family's hope. Through Seth, a different line of humanity would begin, one that the biblical narrative presents as spiritually distinct from the line of Cain. The descendants of Seth are described in a different tone, rather than emphasizing violence or cultural achievements. The Bible tells us that during Seth's time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. This small detail suggests the development of organized worship and spiritual devotion among early human communities. In other words, two different paths were beginning to emerge in the early world. One path focused on the growth of human civilization, cities, technology, art, and social structures. The other emphasized a renewed spiritual connection with God. These two themes would continue to shape the biblical story for generations. As the years passed, humanity continued to multiply across the earth. Families grew larger, communities expanded, and the early foundations of society became more complex. But the tension between human ambition and spiritual faithfulness would remain at the center of the story. And at the heart of it all stood one man whose life stretched across nearly 1,000 years. The first human ever created. Because the Bible records that Adam lived for an astonishing 930 years. During that long lifetime, he would witness the birth of entire generations, the rise of the first cities, and the gradual transformation of the world that once existed beyond the gates of Eden. And the legacy of his life would eventually lead to one of the most mysterious figures in the entire Bible. By the time the world had moved several generations beyond the tragedy of Cain and the death of Abel, humanity had already begun to spread across the land east of the Garden of Eden. The early chapters of the book of Genesis suggest that life was slowly taking shape outside the paradise that the first humans had once known. Families grew, generations multiplied, and the earliest communities of humanity began to form. At the center of this unfolding story stood Adam. According to the biblical record, Adam lived for an astonishing 930 years. During that incredibly long lifetime, he would witness the birth of many descendants, children, grandchildren, and entire generations who were growing up in a world very different from the one he had known in the beginning. Imagine the perspective Adam must have carried through those centuries. He was the only human being alive who remembered life inside Eden. He had seen the rivers flowing through the garden, walked among the trees of paradise, and experienced direct fellowship with God before the world had been changed by disobedience. Every generation that came after him knew that story only through memory and storytelling. For Adam, it had been reality. As his descendants grew, the world outside Eden slowly began to change. The sons and daughters of humanity spread across new territories, exploring lands that had never been settled before. Some followed the traditions of farming, cultivating the soil as Adam had once been instructed. Others raised animals, continuing the way of life that Abel had begun as a shepherd. Over time, these different ways of living began to form the foundation of early society. The descendants of Cain continued building cities and developing new crafts and technologies. Meanwhile, the line that descended from Seth was remembered in the biblical narrative for something else: its devotion to God. The contrast between these two lines becomes more noticeable as the story unfolds. In the lineage of Seth, the Bible begins listing generations in careful order. Names such as Enoch, Kenan, Mahalalel, and Jared appear as part of a long family line that stretches across centuries. Each generation lived for hundreds of years, raising children and continuing the growth of humanity across the earth. But among these names, one figure stands out as especially mysterious. His name was Enoch. The Bible gives only a few sentences about Enoch, yet those sentences have fascinated readers for thousands of years, unlike most of the people listed in the genealogies, whose lives ended with the familiar phrase, "and he died." The story of Enoch ends differently. The scripture simply says that Enoch walked with God. Then it adds a remarkable statement: he was no more, because God took him. This short description suggests that Enoch did not experience death in the ordinary way. Instead, he was taken directly by God. For many readers, this moment introduces one of the earliest mysteries in the entire Bible. What exactly happened to Enoch? Where did he go? And why was he singled out among the generations of humanity? The biblical narrative does not give detailed answers. Yet the story of Enoch became extremely important in later Jewish and Christian traditions. Ancient writings outside the Bible, such as texts associated with the Book of Enoch, expand on his story and describe him as a man who received visions of heavenly realms and divine judgment. Whether those later writings reflect historical events or symbolic traditions remains a subject of debate among scholars. But within the biblical narrative itself, the message about Enoch is clear. He lived a life that was deeply connected to God during a time when much of humanity was moving in the opposite direction. As the generations continued to multiply, the population of the earth grew larger and more complex. Communities expanded into regions that had once been empty. Families formed tribes, and tribes formed early societies. But along with this growth came a troubling trend. The biblical account begins describing a world where violence, corruption, and moral confusion were spreading across human society. The harmony that once existed in the Garden of Eden seemed further away with each passing generation. Humanity was advancing in knowledge and culture, yet something deeper was beginning to unravel. Still, within the line of Seth, a family was quietly preparing the way for a man whose life would soon become one of the most dramatic stories in the entire Bible. His name would be remembered across civilizations and religions for thousands of years. He was the man who would one day build an ark, and his story would begin during the final years of the long life of Adam. By the time the world had grown into multiple generations of humanity, the life of Adam had already stretched across centuries. According to the genealogy recorded in the book of Genesis, Adam lived an extraordinary 930 years. During that immense span of time, he witnessed the transformation of the world from a nearly empty wilderness into a growing network of families, communities, and early civilizations. No other human being in history would ever carry the same memories he did. Adam alone remembered the days inside the Garden of Eden. He had walked among its rivers, seen its trees, and experienced the world as it had once been perfect, peaceful, and untouched by suffering. As the generations multiplied outside the garden, Adam became a living connection to a time that no one else had ever seen. For his children and grandchildren, the story of Eden must have sounded almost like a distant legend. Yet for Adam, it had been reality. Imagine the stories he might have shared with the generations gathered around him. He could describe the beauty of the garden, the moment when humanity first realized the consequences of disobedience, and the sorrow of leaving paradise behind. Through him, the earliest people of the world learned about their origins and about the relationship humanity once had with God. But Adam's life was not defined only by those early memories. He also witnessed the painful consequences that unfolded after humanity left Eden. He experienced the loss of his son Abel and the exile of his son Cain. He saw the rise of early cities among Cain's descendants and the growth of new generations through the line of Seth. Over the centuries, the world around Adam continued to change. Children grew into adults, families expanded, and entire communities formed across the land east of Eden. The descendants of humanity began discovering new skills, building structures, crafting tools, and developing early forms of culture, music, craftsmanship, and organized societies slowly appeared as the generations passed. Yet alongside these advancements came another pattern, one that troubled the biblical narrative. The more humanity expanded, the more corruption and violence seemed to spread. The harmony that once existed in the beginning had become increasingly difficult to find. Jealousy, pride, and conflict appeared again and again throughout the growing population. From Adam's perspective, the transformation must have been heartbreaking. He had seen the world before it was broken. He had known what life was like when humanity walked freely in the presence of God. Now, as he watched new generations rise, he could also see how far the world had drifted from that original harmony. Still, there were moments of hope. The line of Seth continued to produce individuals who sought a closer relationship with God. One of the most remarkable among them was Enoch, a man remembered for walking faithfully with God in a time when much of humanity had turned away. Stories about Enoch must have spread widely during those generations. The idea that someone could live so closely with God that he was taken directly from the earth, without experiencing death, would have inspired awe among the people who heard it. For Adam, hearing about Enoch's life may have stirred deep memories of the connection humanity once shared with its creator. As the centuries passed, Adam eventually grew old even by the standards of the early world described in the Bible. After hundreds of years of life, the moment finally arrived when the first human being would face the reality of death. This moment carried enormous symbolic meaning. Back in the garden, God had warned that disobedience would lead to death. For many years, the consequences of that warning had remained distant. But now, nearly 1,000 years after humanity first left Eden, the original human life was coming to an end. According to the record in the book of Genesis, Adam died at the age of 930. With his passing, the world lost the only living witness to the events that had taken place in the Garden of Eden. The stories of creation, paradise, and humanity's first fall would now exist only through the memories passed down to future generations. Yet Adam's legacy did not end with his death. His descendants continued to spread across the earth, carrying with them the knowledge of their origins and the lessons learned from the earliest chapters of human history. The line that began with Adam and Eve would eventually lead to countless nations, cultures, and civilizations. But within that long line of descendants, one figure would soon rise whose story would become one of the most dramatic turning points in the entire biblical narrative. Because the growing corruption of humanity would eventually reach a point where the world itself would face a devastating judgment. And the man who would stand at the center of that moment was a descendant of Adam whose name would become known across the world. His name was Noah. The story of Adam and Eve does not end with their exile from the Garden of Eden, or even with the long life and eventual death of Adam. In many ways, their story is only the beginning of a much larger narrative, one that continues to shape human understanding of origins, morality, and faith even thousands of years later. According to the account preserved in the book of Genesis, the first humans were more than just historical figures in a distant past. They represent the starting point of the entire human family. Every generation that followed, every nation, culture, and civilization traces its roots back to that first pair who once walked in paradise. Yet their legacy is complex. On one hand, Adam and Eve are remembered as the first to experience the beauty of a perfect world. They lived in harmony with nature, with one another, and with God. The garden where they began their lives symbolized a world without suffering, conflict, or death. But their story also introduces the moment when that harmony was broken. The decision to eat from the forbidden tree did more than change their personal lives. According to the biblical narrative, it introduced a pattern that would echo through all of human history. The struggle between obedience and temptation, between trust and independence, between harmony and division. In that sense, the story of Adam and Eve reflects something deeply familiar about the human condition. Every generation continues to face the same choices they once faced in the garden. The tension between good and evil, wisdom and pride, faith and doubt remains part of the human experience. The ancient story preserved in the book of Genesis presents these struggles not as new problems, but as realities that began at the very beginning of humanity's journey. Yet the legacy of the first humans is not defined only by failure. Even after leaving Eden, Adam and Eve continued building life in a difficult world. They raised children, formed families, and laid the foundation for human society. Their descendants developed agriculture, music, craftsmanship, and communities that eventually grew into civilizations. In other words, the human story continued to unfold with creativity and resilience. Despite the hardships that followed their exile, humanity did not disappear. Instead, it adapted, learned, and expanded across the earth, from the first simple shelters outside Eden to the complex societies that exist today. The entire arc of human history can be traced back to that original beginning. The biblical narrative also suggests that the story of Adam and Eve contains a deeper spiritual message. Even after humanity left the Garden of Eden, the relationship between God and humanity did not completely disappear. The line of Seth included people who continued seeking God, and figures such as Enoch became symbols of faithfulness during difficult times. This idea that humanity could still pursue a relationship with God even after the fall became one of the central themes of the entire biblical story. Generation after generation, the narrative continues through the lives of individuals who struggled, believed, doubted, and hoped. Eventually, those generations would lead to figures such as Noah, whose story introduces another dramatic moment in the early history of humanity. Through all these events, the memory of the first humans remained deeply important. Their story explained where humanity came from, why the world contains both beauty and suffering, and why people continue searching for meaning and restoration for believers. The account of Adam and Eve also points toward the hope that the broken relationship between humanity and God might one day be restored. For thousands of years, philosophers, theologians, and historians have returned to this ancient narrative to explore its meaning. Some read it as literal history. Others see it as symbolic storytelling that communicates profound truths about the human condition. But regardless of interpretation, the influence of Adam and Eve's story cannot be ignored. Their names appear in religious traditions across the world. Their story has inspired countless works of art, literature, and philosophy, and the questions it raises about human nature, responsibility, temptation, and redemption continue to shape discussions about faith and morality even today. From a quiet beginning in a garden to the vast complexity of modern civilization, the legacy of the first humans stretches across every chapter of human history. The world may look very different now from the landscape that once surrounded the Garden of Eden. Cities have replaced wilderness, and technology has transformed daily life in ways that the earliest humans could never have imagined. Yet the core questions that began in that garden remain. Where did humanity come from? Why does the world contain both beauty and suffering? And is it possible for humanity to find its way back to the harmony that once existed in the beginning? These are the questions that have followed the descendants of Adam and Eve throughout history, and they continue to echo into the present day.